All right, I'm excited to be here. Thank you guys so much for coming, and big thanks to Design Dev OKC for allowing me to speak to you guys tonight. I'm like a huge fan of theirs, and I love what they do for Oklahoma City. They've done so much to like bring a lot of creative minds and like designers together through all the things they do and they set up. So really excited. So I'm Will Phillips. I'm a designer, front-end developer. I work for startups and have experience in a variety of things. But tonight, just wanted to basically kind of share a little bit about my background, my story, just to kind of give you guys a taste for what it's like for someone like me, who's a designer like many of you, but working in the startup world, which can be very different from a lot of traditional employment environments. And my hope is just by sharing that story, maybe that'll inspire some of you guys to maybe take a leap and jump into something you've been thinking about. So just to give you a little bit about my background, I was born in New Orleans. All my family's still there. I grew up in Memphis, so, you know, I've been on the Mississippi River most of my life. So love the food and music there in both those cities. But a little over a year ago, I met a wonderful lady, and we got married, and I ended up here in Oklahoma. So that's kind of how I've ended up here from those two cities. And gosh, it's been 8-10 years. I started fresh out, went to community college in Memphis, started freelancing and developed this name, Sleek Design, which is kind of the moniker I went under as a freelancer. Just hustled, did projects for companies around Memphis and, a few around the country. Did that for a little while. After a few years of that, I went to work at an agency in Memphis called Archer Malmo. They were, or are, one of the largest agencies in kind of the Southeast region. Got a lot of great experience there working on, big clients like FedEx, Norfolk Southern, some pharmaceutical companies, things like that. And they have recently expanded to Austin, I think. So they're still growing, they're doing well. But while I was there, started kind of getting into the startup scene in Memphis a little bit. Went to, I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this, but a lot of cities in the US have what they call 48-hour launches or kind of startup weekends. And Memphis started having some of these, and it's basically kind of an all-out sprint, kind of a weekend sprint where a bunch of entrepreneurs or people come and pitch ideas, and people kind of get together and pick a few ideas that they think are really good, and by the end of the weekend, they try to pitch, that idea a little bit more developed or have something built. And it's kind of a contest. Sometimes there's prizes. So I started doing some of that in Memphis a little bit. And, one of the guys at Archer Malmo was really big on that scene, and he was kind of encouraging us to come out and support it. And while I was there, I met my first startup founder and, co-founder and partner, Richard Billings, and we started a company called Leafless. And it was basically a marketplace to support indie authors. We had a really different pricing model, and we were trying to buck the traditional publishing system, which is really old and really immovable. And we went through, I think, a total of 3 accelerators, which, if you're not familiar with that, startup accelerators, you may have heard of Techstars or 500 startups. They usually accept anywhere from 5, 10, 20 startups, depends on the accelerator, give them a small bit of money, and it's basically, the way they describe it, it's a year's worth of work in 3 months. So it's intense, but it does teach you a lot about how to get a company off the ground, a lot about managing a company, how to get traction, how to get sales, etc. Makes you a lot of great connections. And so we came in with this idea. We raised, by the time it was all said and done, probably about $400,000 to build the product and try to get it out and talk to people. But after about 2 or 3 years, it kind of fizzled out. We could never really generate revenue like we wanted to. People loved the concept. We had a lot of people, jump on board with the brand, but we just could never generate that revenue. So that kind of fizzled out. And once that happened, I needed to find more income. So started working with some more guys on another company called Savvy PCI. Partnered with them. How many are familiar with what PCI compliance is? I know that's like, hey, okay, we got a couple guys here. Okay, cool. Is it like easy for you? Yeah, it's not. No, it's not savvy. So these guys have a lot of background in this space and in technology, and they're creating kind of a set of tools to help professionals in this industry better manage PCI compliance and manage that data for their clients. And it basically has to do with, payments, payment security. So making sure that businesses are following security standards when, they're handling your credit card transactions and stuff. So they built a search engine for all of this data that they've sourced from a few different places. So it makes it what would normally take some professionals in this industry, days or a week to locate, they can find within like a few seconds going through our search engine. So they took a little bit different approach to how, it's a little bit more of a bootstrap model, in that they didn't go the venture capital route or try to get a lot of big investors. But through their own time, our own time and personal funds, they've probably invested anywhere from, $500,000 plus into this so far. We've been working on it for about 2 years. And this is currently what I mostly spend my time on. Most of my day-to-day is on this. And I do the branding and product design and front-end development for these guys. So we got a remote team. I work here remotely. Most of us are still in Memphis, which is where I was from. And one of us is in Texas. So got a distributed team there, which is another, can be another challenge of working in a startup. Sometimes you can have a very virtual workflow. So with that said, oh yeah, and Kara mentioned it, but I am working on another company that I'm in the talks with some potential investors for. So if you're interested to hear what that is, I'll tell you that it will be a mobile app, but if you're interested, follow me on Twitter. I'll post updates. You can keep up with me there. So that said, with all that experience, and we've got that out of the way, as I've kind of gone through my career as a designer, I've kind of noticed that there's 4 paths that a lot of up-and-coming designers can take. And it can be hard when you're fresh out of school. What do I do? Where do I go? Well, where should I apply for jobs? But, a lot of them can go on their own, freelance, which that has a lot of advantages, a lot of freedom, flexibility. You can kind of pick projects you want, but there's a lot of downsides to that too. It can be feast or famine. Sometimes it's hard to drum up work. You can go work for a studio or an agency, which is nice. You get to work with a lot of other people on a creative team or a development team. Get to work on bigger projects than you might be able to work on just yourself freelancing. Or you can work in-house for a company, like a corporate company, which is also nice. Sometimes that can feel a little restrictive because you're working on the same thing all the time. But, the stability is a nice advantage of working in a situation like that. But, which I've done, a couple of these. But, as my experience shows, a 4th opportunity has manifested itself in recent years, which is working for startups. And we know, the startup ecosystem and economy itself is kind of a big thing. You hear that buzzword a lot in tech articles and stuff. It's a great opportunity because a lot of the growth in the economy right now is from startups. They're the ones that are creating jobs and doing things. I heard I don't remember his exact title, but he was like the dean of the economy or something at the White House. And he was speaking about the startup ecosystem. And he was talking about how if it were not for the startup economy, the US economy would not be growing. It would still be suffering from the 2008 recession. So startups are doing a lot for the economy. And it's a big shift because of technology, as we know. The industrial age is not as relevant anymore. I mean, all of the companies that hold the power aren't the industrial companies like, the GMs and manufacturing companies and things like that. It's these tech companies like Google, Facebook, et cetera. And because of technology, you can do a lot more with a lot less people. So before I go further, there's like one little pet peeve I have, which is like what a startup is, because so many people have like different definitions of what a startup is. So There's a book called The Lean Startup, which if you're interested in startups at all is a great read. And Eric Ries, the author of that book, defines a startup as this. It's a human institution designed to deliver a new product or service under conditions of extreme uncertainty. So a lot of people like to throw this word around, I'm starting a business, it's a startup. That doesn't always apply. Although it is a broad term, a company that's making millions could still be considered a startup, even if it's been around for a few years. Or, a couple guys in their garage building something new could also be considered a startup. So it does cover a broad range of things, but, a new business that is following a traditional business model, just because it's new to you or you're starting it up new, doesn't necessarily make it a startup. So wanted to make that clear distinction there. So if you're a designer like me and you're interested in getting into startups, I'm going to cover some of the pros and cons, if you will. Working in a startup is tough. It's not easy. It's not for the faint of heart, if you will. There are a lot of challenges, a lot of ups and downs. For example, if you're interested in working in a small company like a startup, you got to be a self-starter. Sometimes it's easier to get into a bigger company where you're following a lot of policies or procedures or workflows or ways of doing things. But in a startup, a lot of times you're having to create that for yourself, and that can be difficult. And if that's not something you can handle well, then you're going to have a really hard time trying to get your work done. You may not last very long. Another thing when working in startups is you have to be a generalist. A lot of times you're working on a lot smaller teams because of strapped resources. So, for example, in an agency or in a company, you may be working with a team of people that all specialize on specific things. You may have someone that, does just mock-ups and UI design, and then someone who does just the branding, and someone who does the building it out, and someone who does the back end. And that's really nice and provides a lot of quality for clients and such. But in a startup, you have to cover a lot of areas like that. You may be the guy doing all of that and it's all on your shoulders. So it can be tough working in a startup. And so, you have to kind of let go of some things that maybe you might be a little bit of a perfectionist on, because you got to get it out, and the company's, relying on something to be released to succeed. So that's another challenge. It is risky. Obviously, startups are very risky. There's high turnover. Sometimes you might be, down to, really low end of your bank account, and you don't know if you're going to get paid next week or next month. And your co-founders are working on trying to find more money or more investors. So it can be really unstable. And that can be difficult to deal with sometimes when you don't know if you're going to have a job next year, if this thing is going to last the next 6 months. So that can be hard too. And it's stressful. Most entrepreneurs will tell you it's an emotional roller coaster. I mean, one day everything will be going great for you. And you're like, yes, we got these investors. We got like 5 new customers. Everything's great. And then the next day, like, man, they all left. The investors bailed. Like, it just all goes to pot. And that's the way it is with startups, and they can be like that from day to day. So yeah, there's some hard stuff with startups, but there's some pros too. Because, while at the same time you have to handle a lot more, it also gives you an opportunity to get a lot more experience than you would working in an environment where you specialize in one thing, or you're only able to touch a few things within a company. So it can be a huge opportunity to learn a lot very quickly. It also creates an opportunity for you to take bigger ownership of your work. You have a lot more input in a smaller team to really steer things the way you think is best, or the way you know is best as a designer or developer. And so there's a cool opportunity to do that in a startup environment where you may not ever get that chance in a bigger company. So that's another really cool thing that can be great about working in startups. And you can make a lot of money, which most people don't mind. I mentioned the risk factor earlier, and that's very true. But when you're working with a startup, especially if you're like a co-founder or a partner in the company, there's no ceiling on what you can earn in a startup. there was a guy in DC that talked about this a lot, and he was saying how, like, in your traditional employee structure, you know, you work and you get your raises, and, you know, your financial gain grows 1.2x, 1.5x every year. And, you know, that's great, and that's offers a lot of stability. But with startups, you can get, you know, 5, 10, 20x return. I mean, there's no limit on what you could potentially make working in a startup, especially if it does well and there's a big exit. So that's a nice pro for working in startups if you're willing to take that risk. And, you know, again, because you have more ownership of your work in a startup and you can do a lot more, you can have a bigger impact with what you do. And especially if you find something that you're passionate about and you find a startup that's solving a problem that you think is a real need in the world, that gives you a really big opportunity to do something with your work to make a big impact. And that's a really cool place to be with your work. So that kind of gives you the pros and cons of, you know, working in startups and, you know, a little bit of my experience. So, you know, just to wrap up, I hope that maybe by getting a little bit of a glimpse of what it's like to work in my world, you know, it might encourage you, if you're interested in working in startups, to try to find opportunities like that. Starspace here is really great for that. I know I haven't gotten as connected to them, but I know there's a startup OKC that does things here. And, you know, jump in and, you know, find ways to help out and find opportunities to start companies. Or maybe you have your own idea and, you know, you want to get it out there and see what can happen. So, you know, all you got to do is just jump in. I know that can be kind of a fearful thing for a lot of people, you know, to quit your job, take this risk. A lot of people think entrepreneurs are crazy because of the crazy risks they take sometimes with their lives to bet on an idea, but you won't know unless you jump in and try it. And, you know, you can set goals for yourself and point yourself in any direction, but, you know, you're never going to get anywhere unless you start moving. So, and, you know, don't look at failure as failure. You know, failure is progress. Just learn from it, keep going. You know, if you try this out and it doesn't work, that's okay. You know, if you jump into a startup and it fails after a year and you only made your little bit of money from working for them, you still probably got more out of that year than you would have working for another company, a normal company. Especially with all the things you took on, everything you did, all the things you got exposed to, and that, you know, even if the startup doesn't succeed, that still gives you a lot professionally to work with after the fact. So failure's okay. You learn from it, keep moving. And so, you know, I hope that even if maybe startups are not your thing, or you think that, you know, this guy's just out of his mind for doing this, who would ever do that? But, you know, you don't have to apply this to startups. You know, again, my hope is just to inspire you guys a little bit. And whether it's a startup or not, or maybe a project you've been wanting to try, just all there is to do it is just to jump in and try it. So thank you guys so much for listening to me and hearing my story a little bit. I hope you enjoyed it. Was there any questions? We got time for Q&A? Okay, 10 minutes? All right, 10 minutes for questions. Anybody have any questions for me? Or yeah.
How do you suggest getting started in Oklahoma City if someone did want to go join a startup?
So your question is, how could someone get into this if they were interested in getting into startups? Getting connected to some of the people here at Starspace is a really great idea. A lot of the people that work here and run Starspace are connected to a lot of those things happening on that scene here. There's also a startup OKC that I mentioned. I think they're on Meetup. Are they on Meetup, Jared? That startup OKC? Where could they find them? They're on, yeah. So look for startup OKC on Meetup. I think they regularly do events, and I think they have those 48-hour launches that I mentioned too. I think they do like 1 or 2 a year. Oh, there you go. Next one's in November, so maybe look them up. That'd be a great way, and that's a great way to meet other entrepreneurs in the city and see ways you can connect with them, and maybe even, you know, find opportunities to jump in on some stuff like that. Yeah. Any other questions? Oh, yes.
What do you look for in a founder, and what are some qualities that you avoid?
So what do you look for in a founder, and what are some qualities to avoid? That's a loaded question. You want somebody that will stay committed, and that's something you have to gauge, and that can be a long process. Even investors, when you're trying to raise money for your company, that can take 6 months to a year. I mean, it's almost like you have to date the investors, and they research everything about you and your background and your mom and your cousins and everybody. And the same is true of founders. I mean, obviously, if you're asking somebody to that you can depend on to help you build this and make this a success. So you need somebody that you're sure you can depend on, that won't just bail on you when it gets rough. And it's also good, find someone who complements your needs too. So if you're strong in one area and weak in another, find somebody who can fill that gap for you. So, if I'm a designer, I would try to find somebody who's really good at, back-end development, because that would help me and kind of complete the whole set we need to make sure that we can build this thing. So that's another good thing to keep in mind too. If you're looking for a founder to help you start an idea, find somebody you can depend on and find somebody that fits what you need to make it happen. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yes. So let me make sure I heard you right. If I'm coming into a new startup, how do I make sure they're kind of up to par on the quality? When you're leaving a startup? Well, it depends on how you leave. I mean, if the startup is like closing its doors, then there's not much to worry about. But if you're moving on, to a different opportunity, part of it can be some of the work you did there, setting up, guidelines and patterns and things to follow for the next person. And it depends on your position in the company too. If you're kind of an entry-level founder, not entry-level, but when the company started, kind of a top-level founder, if you leave, typically it's not an easy process. Because you're so tied to that company, and so much of what you did is kind of integral to that company. When you leave, you got to make sure somebody else is there to pick up to fill that void. So it can be difficult, not to mention, other things that can be affected. But the nice way to do it would be to help find your replacement before you leave. And that would be finding somebody that meets your standards and that you would be fine kind of handing, the company off to. So does that kind of answer your question? Okay. Yeah. Yes, sir. That varies a lot. It depends on a lot on what stage you come into the company. So early stage, you guys can determine how you want to split it, if it's 50-50, 40-60, whatever. And then oftentimes that will get switched up. If you take on investment from a venture capital firm, they're going to want their share of the company, which dilutes what you guys have. I think I read somewhere that on average, most founders who take on money, by the time they make their exit, probably have about a third of what their original shares were when they took on investment. So that gives you kind of an idea of how that usually kind of works out by the time it's all done. Yeah. And usually, again, that's something that you and your founders would have to work out. But that's also something that investors will try to set in their terms as well when they're offering you money, if you get money like that. So, yeah. Any other questions about designing, working in startups, working remotely? Yes?
How does the, you said that you first worked with investors and then you went to the lean business model. Like, how did that affect your design process?
Not that much. I try to do, my work as best I can, regardless of the situation. It can be stressful sometimes when, you're kind of strapped and, you don't know what the future of the company is, and it can be hard to stay committed if you don't know there's a long-term road there, which is a challenge of being in startups and working as an entrepreneur. But despite that, you still want to do your best work, as you would anywhere. But also the fact that that contributes to the success of the company too. So, if I've done a lot of things from not just, specific work on like designing the product or the website or the branding or things like that that might be very publicly visible, but, designing pitch decks that, my partners use to, pitch our company to investors, or, documents or white papers and things like that. There's a lot of other things that go along in designing and working in a startup that you have to support, and kind of do your part to carry that load. So, yeah. Anyone else? Yes, sir. In terms of who owns your work while you're working at the startup? Yeah. A lot of that can be determined when you sign on. Always, do stuff with contracts and do it in writing, especially in startups. Even if it's with your family or your friends, do things the right way. And a lot of times those terms are kind of outlined there, whether it's, it's a non-disclosure thing or a non-compete thing. All that can kind of get worked out similar to how you would if you were working for an agency. Yeah, nothing too drastic or out of the ordinary there. Yeah. All right. Anybody else have any more questions? Yes, sir.
So, you mentioned something about start weekend. What's the process? A lot of people work their start weekend and stuff.
Sure. So,
Get some light on what happens if you move forward, and then how that timeline is expected based on your experience.
sure.
Find money, how you find money.
Yeah. So, a great well, let me start at the beginning. Your first question was, what happens at startup weekends? So, most startup weekends usually it's usually open to the public, and they invite entrepreneurs and other people with skill sets. Anybody can go, really. Whether you're a financial professional or a lawyer or a designer or a developer, like, all these skills are needed to start a business or to advise someone trying to start a business. So they encourage all these kind of people to come to this event. It typically, when they're 48 hours, typically start on like a Friday evening, and they kind of just kick things off, tell everybody how it all works, and then they will invite anyone who wants to, who has an idea, to usually do like 30-second, 1-minute pitches, short, quick pitches. So people get up in front of whoever's there, the crowd, the audience, pitch their ideas, and at the end of that, and they all vary on how they select them, but it usually gets narrowed down to just like a few ideas. And then everybody there kind of decides how they want to support these few ideas for the weekend, whether, they need some legal advice, or they need some IP help, intellectual property, or, I need a designer, I need a logo, I need the, and they decide, they all work together, they kind of team up, and then figure out, what they're going to finish within that 48 hours. Sometimes the organizers of the event will kind of determine, what the goal is by the end of the weekend. Sometimes it's left up to the teams. Sometimes there's prizes, cash prizes, or other prizes in the way of special connections or resources or promotional deals that, would help them continue on with this idea or give them a boost to starting that business. So, and they're designed in such a way to kind of stimulate that entrepreneurship in a community. So that's typically what happens at those events. And then, and like I said, it's a great way to get connected to other people in the community who are doing things. And also, it's a great draw to people who are looking for good ideas to invest in. Who are the entrepreneurs in this community? Who's doing what? Let me come check it out and see what's going on here. So that's also a great way to meet those kind of people. And when it comes to investors, people have written books on that. It's You know, you can cold call, cold email a lot of venture capital firms, try to pitch them your idea. The best is always to get a warm introduction. So if you know somebody who might maybe know some more people, that's the best way to get connected to venture capitalists and, you know, try to get that money. So does that mostly answer your question? Okay. So what's the path from that point to being a running company? How did it work out for me? So we did a little 48-hour weekend thing like that. The first company I mentioned, which was Leafless, and we kept working on it, and I kept my main job and was moonlighting. And the guys that organized that event in Memphis really liked our idea and saw potential in it, so they kept working with us. Excuse me. And encouraged us to apply for the accelerator program they had there in Memphis, which they only invited, at the time, 6 startups to a year, and they gave them $15,000 for the accelerator, to get through the accelerator and launch your business. After that accelerator program, after 3 months, culminated in a demo day, which they invited a bunch of community leaders, investors, and all of the startups in the accelerator gave a 10-minute pitch of their companies in front of all these people. And from there, we made some connections and were able to keep talking with some people and do some more work, and were able to secure some investment from there, which we probably got about 6 to 9 months later, so, which was that 300,000 to 400,000 we raised that I mentioned. So, yeah, is that okay? Cool. All right, how are we on time? We're good. Okay, all right, we're done. Thank you guys. Really appreciate you. Listen.